everybody, welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 22nd. So as you can see in the notes below, I've got basically the notes for this particular video, and this week will be the week that's visible on our homepage. As you know, I had indicated that I retire previous weeks and I put them in the past class sessions folder, which you can find in the top of our Moodle. So that's where you can see last week's notes, where we basically reviewed the class and talked a little bit about some terminology and some methodology related to media and popular culture. I see that as kind of introductory. And today's two chapters are also introductory. We start to actually talk about the media next class, where we get to talk about the internet. But the two chapters that I had assigned for us today, advertising and commercial culture, which in the newest edition of the book is in chapter 10, or public relations and framing the message, which is in chapter 11 of the newest edition of the book. And as you know, you can use earlier editions, but the chapter headings might be labeled differently, or they might be numbered differently. Certainly with media, which is something that's so rapidly changing, the more recent the text, the better off we are, probably, because it will use examples and reference things that are much more applicable to our current time. Though the reality is that media is moving so quickly that by the time a book is published, it's probably out of date in some respects. The reason why I wanted to start with advertising and public relations, because both are basically the glue that holds together all of media. They help to finance media and to promote elements of media. So in terms of thinking about the assignments for this class, I had indicated that you will be writing informal journals, about a page or so response of each of the pieces of media that we will be examining. So next class, we are going to be talking about the internet, and then your first journal will be due on the internet the class after that, the 29th. So what that means is that you can utilize the information from the textbook and the information from class in your own responses in your journal. And I'm not looking for anything in particular. You could perhaps focus on a particular element that we've discussed in class, or perhaps an element that we didn't have a chance to discuss in class related to the topic. And again, your first topic will be the internet. It could be your own personal experiences. It could be questions that you have that were raised by the textbook or the class. There are lots of different ways that you can proceed, and a page is just a guesstimate. I've had students do more, do less, depending on their interest level. But if you do that for all of the pieces of media over the course of the semester, you'll have a nice running commentary with my commentary in turn, because I'm going to be asking you to submit that into my email, which is how my grading program works best, at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I'm going to respond to your journals informally. I think you can think about the journal as a kind of diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you're writing about particular topics we're studying in class. And certainly, though, you can relate those topics to your personal life. And I'm not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. So you can certainly reference what we've talked about thus far. And again, thus far, we've talked about some terminology with media and popular culture, as well as some research methods for media and popular culture. In terms of advertising, and there's some more definitions here, which is oftentimes what you find in a 100 level class, where you're introduced to definitions and jargons of the discipline. Advertising, the deliberate calling attention of product and service with intent to influence behavior, purchasing behavior usually. And we know that there have been all kinds of changes because of the internet, and that includes changes to advertising. I am old enough to remember when the internet was first introduced, and believe it or not, we were told that it would be advertising free, which sounds absolutely ludicrous, but that was the goal. And it's something that we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about the internet next class. As you know, the majority of email now is made up of spam, junk mail. Internet data mining has definitely taken over the world of advertising, where now you can have very targeted ads to very specific individuals and specific demographics or categories of groups of individuals. Video ads have definitely taken over print ads, and social media influencers have become perhaps our new hucksters for advertising products. Amazon has completely revolutionized the digital market, or the marketplace. We no longer have brick and mortar stores in the way that we used to think of them. And digital data mining, which began with Facebook, but basically all media, social media, has been utilizing that, been targeting specific audiences, and have led to all kinds of questions about privacy. Basically, what Amazon was able to do was to replace brick and mortar stores, and not just Amazon, others have followed suit, but Amazon is the biggest of them all, where digital ads become basically the kind of store itself, and they are interactive. The industry of advertising began around the 1800s. There are some name brands that you probably still recognize from today, like Campbell's Soup. Um, but advertising has existed since the beginning of time, where we've had town criers, for instance. Now, there have been all kinds of scandals associated with advertising, going back to Campbell's Soup. The idea that they were deceiving audiences by putting marbles into their soup so that the ingredients in the soup would rise to the top and the soup would look more hearty. Um, and Coca-Cola is a wonderful example of perhaps the most famous name brand across the planet that also led to some regulation. There were many unregulated patent medicines, and Coca-Cola could have been considered among that group because it had elements of cocaine in it, which were eventually replaced with caffeine and led to the formation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to begin to evaluate the authenticity of ads and the safety of products. Ad agencies were the primary way of making advertising into a profession in the 1900s. If you've ever seen the television show Mad Men, they give some great examples of the heyday of ad agencies in the 50s, where ad agencies would focus on slogans and visual design and were oftentimes run by men, creating ads that were ironically targeted towards women because it was thought that women were the great purchasers in the home place. And that led to a lot of stereotypical depictions of female at the time. Ad agencies also help to create the idea of brand identity, where, again, some of these brands still exist today. Quaker Oats, Ivory Soap. The reality is that most products are usually more similar than different, but if you can convince an audience that a particular brand has superiority, and oftentimes that's linked with price because it'll have a higher price, in part to finance the advertising, ironically, then ultimately you can be very successful. And this requires doing market research and trying to get a sense of who your audience is, what groups they belong to. We talk about this in terms of demographics, what groups based on age or ethnicity or gender or any other characteristics can individuals be put into, so that there can be some kind of psychological profiling, try to make decisions about, or try to make predictions about the decisions that individuals might make based on their beliefs, what they think is true and false, based on their attitudes, their emotional responses, based on their values, which basically underlie beliefs and underlie attitudes. Again, you want to be careful not to stereotype because there is individual difference, but there is a certain level of predictability with that. So if you don't think that's the case, then you might want to think about how marketing anticipates, identifies, and satisfies customer needs and wants. The Super Bowl is probably the one of the biggest examples of how incredibly um, influential the marketing and advertising industries are, and also incredibly expensive and profitable. Um, but again, as we know, that television viewing has certainly decreased. So even though the Super Bowl is one of those events that tends to unify large numbers of audience members, audiences have really departed from television and are more influenced by digital media. And the idea of regulating advertising, and this is a kind of tricky place because you've got freedom of speech, obviously, but also you don't want to do something in your advertising that is deliberately offensive or deliberately manipulative or deliberately harmful. So some suggestions or some things that have been regulated, things like subliminal advertising, hidden messages in an ad to try to influence behavior. Product placement, where a product is placed somewhere to, again, on a subconscious level, influence you to want that particular product. Association principle, the idea that oftentimes elements in ads are associated with positive things. I believe the example you're given is that an automobile will oftentimes be associated with nature, even though those two are conflicting in many respects. It's technology and the natural world, but the idea is that if you can connect the natural world to technology, again, on some subconscious basis, you will feel that you can embrace the natural world through the technology. Children's advertising is particularly sticky. Just watch some children's programming and see how much advertising is directed towards things like sugary processed foods or toys or entertainment. Prescription drug ads have become particularly problematic, and they definitely influence consumer behavior. And puffery and deception, much like I was indicating with that very famous Campbell Soup ad. The idea of political advertising, where now politicians are sold much like products. And the strategies used can be very developed and refined. It could be a famous person testimonial or endorsement. Again, influencers have sort of taken the role of what movie stars oftentimes used to do. The plain folks pitch that you want to be just like everybody else, so that if you want to purchase this product, you'll be like everybody else. The snob appeal, you don't want to be like everybody else. Note the contradictory element here, that you want to be better than everybody else. We'll oftentimes see this with automobiles, which are usually the most expensive purchases you'll make outside of buying a home and financing an education. Do you want a car that is perhaps the most popular in America? So you're the plain folks, or do you want the car that is exclusive to the wealthy, and that's the snob appeal. The hidden fear appeal, creating fears where they never existed before. That you need to use products like deodorant or perfume, or else you are going to be socially isolated. The bandwagon effect. Again, everybody else is doing it. The number one product, why not you? Irritation advertising, which is counterintuitive, but if you annoy somebody enough, they're likely to remember the ad, and that might, in effect, help with purchasing in the future. Association advertising, as I was saying earlier, about connecting two things that are very dissimilar. Storytelling and myth production. Ads tell stories, narratives, granted in much more condensed form that we might see in pieces of literature. Saturation advertising, where the advertising just is so overwhelming that you can't escape it. Again, there's a reason why Coca-Cola is the #1 recognizable brand in not just America, but in the world. And we've been saturated with their advertising. Now, chapter 12 talks about public relations, which is similar to, albeit somewhat different from advertising. Public relations is deliberately promoting a positive image and goodwill. So, certainly, public relations works hand in hand with advertising. And there are subtle and complex ways to influence public sentiment, a way to try to control the narrative. You might have heard of P.T. Barnum, and he's known, of course, for The Circus, the greatest show on earth. He also was known for using outlandish efforts to secure newspaper coverage, oftentimes staging events or just complete hoaxes, in order to get some publicity. Media messages to spread information about a person, a corporation, an issue, a policy. There is the belief that, all publicity is good publicity, even bad publicity. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but there is that belief that as long as you can get yourself some publicity, it doesn't matter if it's negative or positive. Lobbyists have basically taken this to influence lawmaker votes. So it's a pretty complex subject. The industry, as an industry, began in the early 1900s, and Ivy Lee was a very famous person in the industry, and argued that basically honesty and directness was the best public relations tack to take, because that would get buy-in from your audience. Not that it was because it was ethical, but again, it would be about getting buy-in with your audience. And Ivy argued that crowds don't reason, so they're influenced by symbols. And perhaps there's a certain level of truth to that. I can't help but think of the 1980s, and this was something that I experienced because I was a teenager in the 1980s. Tylenol went through quite a difficult time from a publicity standpoint, because there was somebody who was poisoning Tylenol tablets in supermarkets across America. And their public relations firm had recommended to them that instead of trying to bury the story, which was their initial inclination, that they should be as transparent as possible, pull the products from the shelves, and not release the products until they could guarantee safety. That actually led to changes in packaging for products such as Tylenol and other medications. So if you are familiar with the aluminum seal that you need to break before you can get into medication that's sold over the counter, that resulted from Tylenol's creation that others mimicked after that Tylenol scare of the 1980s. So how do people in public relations spread these messages? Sometimes they create press releases. They're trying to make it seem like a news story, but it's really more like an advertisement. Video news releases, and of course, so much of our society has moved from print to video. Earned media, that if you have earned the respect of the media, then they are likely to publish what you are trying to release as a publicist or as a PR person. Public service announcements are other kinds of techniques of public relations. Public relations oftentimes has this negative connotation and association with it, as does advertising, but it can be positive. Advertising helps to promote products, and it helps to generate economic growth. And something like public relations helps with things like public service announcements for the greater good. But public relations can also plan events that are sometimes known as pseudo events. They're not really events, they're more of an opportunity to sell a particular image. Lobbying, as I was talking about with political candidates, is another technique. Propaganda. This is publicity and advertising trying to gain public support for a particular issue. For instance, trying to gain support for a war effort from a government. And again, propaganda is oftentimes seen as a negative because there usually is an element of manipulation associated with it. which leads to the questions of ethics and what is ethical in public relations and advertising. What's the line, if there is a line? And you can see in the notes below that I wanted to direct your attention to some documentaries that I recommend about these two topics. Again, I see these topics as introductory. You don't necessarily have to write journals about them, but certainly you can reference these topics in your upcoming journals. One documentary is somewhat dated. It was from 2004. It's from PBS Frontline, and it's entitled The Persuaders. And it talks about advertising and public relations becoming basically our environment. There is no way to escape that. It's everywhere. It's 55 minutes long, and I've included the link if you wanted to see it. I also wanted to tell you about the Media Education Foundation, which actually is housed in Northampton. So a neighbor, where they produce documentaries about the influence of media. And you might have seen some of these documentaries in some of your other classes. One was referenced in our textbook, Tough Guys by Jackson Katz. But the one that I wanted us to focus on was Killing Us Softly, which perhaps you might have seen in other classes. Oftentimes it's examined in sociology or psychology classes. Basically, it was a study of women's images in advertising, and the researcher, Jean Kilbourne, basically started in the 1970s, and then every decade after that began updating her research, finding that there were really more similarities between decades than differences between decades. And in 2019, there was a Smith College panel discussion talking about her work that includes people such as Jackson Katz, who is known for his work for Tough Guys, which was his examination of male images in media. So I wanted you to watch this particular panel discussion, not only because it was local, but also because it gives you an idea of how to implement some of what we talked about last class with media research. And certainly I don't expect you to do anything as sophisticated or developed as what Jackson Katz has done, or Jean Kilbourne, or Sue Jolly, or some of the other people on the panel. But this gives you an idea of the kind of work that people can do in media. And it is a little bit long, but I think it's quite worth it. It's an hour and 33 minutes. And this is what your class discussion form question is going to be based on. I'm going to ask, what is one of the more interesting points in Killing Us Softly Then and Now? The panel discussion you're going to watch, and why. And obviously there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just more curious about your reasoning for why than anything else. Of course, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you're encouraged to, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And what you should get is basically a nice overview of a class discussion. If we were in a face-to-face class, we would actually watch Killing Us Softly Then and Now, and then talk a little bit about some of the interesting elements. So I've got the YouTube link there for you to watch this particular presentation and then answer the discussion forum response, which will be due Thursday, the 24th. As you know, you have 48 hours to respond to your discussion forum. Though certainly if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I will leave you to watch Killing Us Softly Then and Now. Take care. Bye-bye.